The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October while I was folding laundry in the bedroom I'd been sleeping in for the past 3 years, my son's spare room, the one with the window that faced the neighbor's fence, and never got any real light. I remember the exact moment because I'd just finished pairing my son's socks, something I'd started doing without anyone asking, the way you do when you're trying to justify your presence in someone else's home. My phone buzzed on the dresser, a number I didn't recognize with a Toronto area code. "Is this Judith Hartwell?" a man's voice asked. "It is," I said. "Ms. Hartwell, my name is Robert Finch. I'm a solicitor with Finch and Associates in Toronto. I'm calling regarding the estate of your sister, Doris Ann Hartwell." I sat down on the edge of the bed. Doris had passed 6 weeks earlier. Pancreatic cancer, swift and merciless. We'd been close when we were young, drifted apart through the busy years, and then found each other again after my husband Paul passed. She'd never married, no children. She'd spent 40 years as a senior administrator at the University of Toronto, lived quietly, invested carefully, and apparently told no one, not even me, the full picture of what she'd built. "Ms. Hartwell," Robert Finch said, "your sister named you sole beneficiary of her estate. That includes her condominium on Bloor Street, a rental property in Kingston, and her investment portfolio. Combined, we're looking at approximately $2.6 million. I didn't say anything. I just sat there with a balled-up sock in each hand. "Ms. Hartwell, are you still there?" "Yes," I said. "I'm here. I need a moment." I'd been a high school English teacher for 31 years in Guelph. I'd retired at 62, a year after Paul died, because the grief made everything feel impossible and I couldn't stand in front of a room full of teenagers pretending to care about semicolons. I'd sold our house, the house where we'd raised 2 children, where I'd planted 3 gardens, where Paul had built a deck by hand the summer before he got sick, because I couldn't afford to keep it alone on my pension and the small amount of savings we had left after his illness. My son had offered me the spare room. "Just until you figure things out, Mum," he'd said. His wife, I'll call her my daughter-in-law, because that's what she is, had smiled tightly and said, "Of course, Judith, we'd love to have you. That was 3 years ago." In those 3 years, I had cooked most of the weeknight dinners. I had driven my grandchildren to hockey practice and orthodontist appointments and birthday parties while their parents worked. I had done their laundry when the pile got too high. I had become, without anyone formally deciding it, the household help, unpaid, unthanked, and utterly dependent. I told myself it was fine, that this was what family did, that I was lucky to have somewhere to go. I hung up with Robert Finch after setting up an appointment for the following week. I held the phone in my lap for a long time. $2.6 million. Doris, quiet, careful Doris, who'd worn the same winter coat for 15 years and brought her own tea bags to restaurants. I thought of her small apartment, always tidy, always smelling faintly of Earl Grey and old books. I thought of how she'd squeezed my hand at Paul's funeral and said, "You're tougher than you know, Jude." I thought of how I was going to walk downstairs and tell my son, and how his face would change when he heard the number. I was so happy. I want you to understand that. In that moment, sitting on the edge of the bed in the dim spare room, I was genuinely, overwhelmingly happy, not because of the money itself, but because of what it meant. It meant I could stop being a burden. I could get my own place. I could stop folding other people's socks. I wanted to share that with my son. He was my son. For 35 years, he had been the person in the world I loved most completely. I stood up, walked to the door, opened it, and started down the hall toward the staircase. That's when I heard them. My son's voice first, low, careful, the tone he used when he was calculating something. I stalked at the top of the stairs. The kitchen was directly below. I could hear every word through the open ceiling vent that my daughter-in-law had complained about fixing for 2 years. "The question is timing," my son said. "We have to move before she talks to anyone." My daughter-in-law's voice was clipped, efficient. A financial advisor, a lawyer, anyone. Once she has independent advice, it gets complicated. She doesn't know any lawyers in Toronto. She doesn't need to know one. She could find one. My point is, we need to be the first people she talks to about what to do with it. A pause. The sound of a chair scraping. "What are you thinking?" my son asked. "Joint accounts. She trusts you completely. If you explain it as just being practical, that it's easier to manage, easier for us to help her, she'll agree. She always agrees with you." "And the condo on Bloor?" "We sell it. The rental in Kingston, too. Cash is easier to manage than properties, easier to consolidate." My hand was on the wall beside the staircase. I could feel my own pulse. "What about Mum?" my son said, and for one terrible second I thought he was going to say something that would make this okay, some version of this conversation that I had misunderstood. "She stays here," my daughter-in-law said. "That's the whole point. If she has her own place, we lose any influence over how she spends it. But if she's here, comfortable, and the accounts are structured so that major decisions need both signatures, she's not going to like that. She won't know to dislike it until it's already done. And by then," a small laugh, soft and certain, "by then she'll be used to it." I stood at the top of those stairs for what felt like a very long time. I'd taught literature for 31 years. I knew how betrayal worked in stories. The sudden revelation, the floor dropping away, the moment the protagonist realizes the world they thought they were living in was a different world entirely. I'd explained it to teenagers 100 times. I'd never expected to feel it in my own hallway, in my son's house, while holding a pair of balled-up socks. I walked quietly back to my room. I closed the door. I sat back down on the bed. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. I think I was too shocked to cry. I just sat there with the phone in my hand, and I thought about my sister Doris, and I thought about Paul, and I thought about the 35 years I had spent believing that whatever else happened, I could trust my son. Then I did something I had never done before in my life. I opened my phone, searched Estate Lawyer Toronto, and called the first number that came up with strong reviews. The receptionist said they could see me Thursday morning. "I'll take it," I said. I went downstairs 20 minutes later. I had washed my face. My hands had stopped shaking. "There you are," my daughter-in-law said from the kitchen island, where she was scrolling through her phone. "We were wondering if you wanted to eat with us tonight." "That would be lovely," I said. My son was at the stove. He turned and smiled at me, the same smile he'd had since he was a boy, open and warm. And I felt something settle in my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet. Something colder. Something like resolve. "Good day," he asked. "Quiet," I said. "Just some phone calls." I sat down at the kitchen table and helped my daughter-in-law set out the placemats, and I listened to my grandchildren argue about a video game, and I ate the pasta my son had made, and I said almost nothing. I was very good at saying almost nothing. 31 years of teaching had made me skilled at staying calm on the surface, while something was working hard underneath. That night, after everyone was in bed, I wrote down everything I remembered from the conversation I'd overheard. Every phrase, every implication. I didn't know exactly what I would need, but I knew enough to know that I should have a record. Thursday morning, I told my daughter-in-law I was going to see my doctor for a routine checkup. She barely looked up from her coffee. "Drive safe," she said. The law office was on King Street West, on the 11th floor of a glass building that looked out over the lake. The lawyer's name was Susan Park. She was probably 50, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and the directness I liked immediately. I told her everything. The phone call from Robert Finch, the conversation I'd overheard, the 3 years in the spare room, the socks. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk. "First," she said, "I want to be clear about something, because it's important and I suspect no one has told you yet. In Ontario, an inheritance you receive is your separate property. It does not automatically become family property in your son's marriage. And it is certainly not something your son can access without your explicit consent." I exhaled. "Second," she said, "nothing your daughter-in-law described, joint accounts, consolidated funds, dual signatures, can happen without you agreeing to it. The moment you sign nothing, they have nothing. So I'm protected," I said. "As long as you act carefully, yes. The risk is that they convince you to sign something before you understand what you're signing. That's what they're counting on, your trust and your unfamiliarity with financial structures." She recommended a financial advisor in her network. She helped me understand the estate process, what steps needed to happen with Robert Finch, how to ensure the properties were transferred correctly into my name alone. She also said something I've thought about many times since. "You don't owe anyone an explanation for your own money," she said. "Not your son. Not anyone. It is yours." I drove home along the Gardiner. The lake was gray and enormous to my left. I thought about Doris, how she'd lived quietly and deliberately and never let anyone make decisions for her. I thought about how I'd spent 3 years making myself small in someone else's house. So grateful for the spare room that I'd stopped asking myself what I actually wanted. I knew what I wanted now. I wanted my own kitchen. I wanted to wake up without calculating how much space I was taking up. I wanted to plant something. Over the next 3 weeks, I said nothing. I went to my appointment with Robert Finch and completed the estate paperwork. I had the condo on Bloor and the rental property in Kingston transferred into my name as per Doris's wishes. I had a second meeting with Susan Park and set up a financial structure she recommended. My own accounts, a modest managed portfolio, everything in my name only. My son brought up the inheritance once, over dinner, about 10 days after my call with Robert Finch. "Mum," he said carefully, setting down his fork, "have you thought about what you're going to do with it all? It's a lot to manage on your own." My daughter-in-law looked up from her plate. "I've made some appointments," I said. "I have a lawyer and a financial advisor. They're helping me sort it out." A pause. My daughter-in-law's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. "That's great," my son said. "Of course. We just want to make sure you're not overwhelmed." "I appreciate that," I said. "I feel good about it." He looked at his wife. She looked at her plate. Neither of them brought it up again. I found the apartment in late November. a two-bedroom on the second floor of a low-rise building in the annex neighborhood close enough to the university that I could walk to the library, with a small balcony where I could, in spring, put out containers for herbs and tomatoes. The building was quiet. The neighbors were mostly retired professors and a few young graduate students who kept odd hours but were perfectly pleasant in the elevator. The day I signed the lease, I sat in the empty apartment for a while. Just sat there on the floor with my coat still on in the quiet. The afternoon light came through the balcony door and lay across the hardwood in long, pale strips. I thought about Paul and how much he would have liked this neighborhood. I thought about Doris, who had spent her whole life making careful, independent choices and left me the proceeds. I thought about the conversation at the top of the stairs, and how a different version of me, the version who had been grateful and quiet and careful not to take up too much space, might have walked down those stairs and handed her entire future to people who had already decided what to do with it. I told my son I was moving out on a Sunday afternoon when we were alone in the kitchen. My daughter-in-law had taken the children to her mother's. I found a place, I said, in Toronto, the annex. I move in December 15th. He looked surprised. Genuinely, I think. I don't believe he had considered this possibility. Mum, are you sure? The city is expensive, and you'd be on your own. I'm 63, I said. I've been on my own before. He was quiet for a moment. I just mean, we're here. We wanted to help. I looked at my son, my boy, who I had driven to hockey and read to at bedtime and watched grow into a man, and I said carefully, I know, but I need to do this my way. I didn't tell him what I'd heard. I thought about it. I thought about it for a long time, but I'd talked to Susan Park about it, and she'd said something that stayed with me. Confrontation will only tell you whether they're sorry they got caught. It won't change what they plan to do. I didn't need that conversation. I already knew what I needed to know. Moving day was a Saturday in mid-December, cold and bright, with a thin glaze of ice on the sidewalks that crunched underfoot. I didn't have much. Most of my furniture was still in storage from when I'd sold the Guelph house. My own dining table, Paul's armchair, the lamp from the living room that I'd always loved. The movers brought everything up in 3 hours and left me alone in a space that was, at last, entirely mine. My grandchildren came to visit the following weekend with a poinsettia from their school's Christmas fair. My grandson, who was 10, ran from room to room like he was inspecting it. "Grandma," he said, "you have a balcony." "I do," I said. "Can we have hot chocolate?" "That," I said, "is exactly what balconies are for." We sat out there in the cold with our mugs, wrapped in blankets I'd unpacked from storage, looking out at the street below where Christmas lights blinked in the bare branches of the trees. My grandson told me about a book he was reading. My granddaughter, who was 7, fell asleep against my arm with her mug still in her hands. I thought about my sister. I thought about how she'd spent her whole life making room for herself, and how she'd somehow known, even at the end, that I needed the same chance. That spring, I planted cherry tomatoes and 2 kinds of basil on the balcony. I joined a book club at the local library branch 3 blocks away. I started walking every morning along Philosopher's Walk, past the ravine and the old stone buildings, sometimes stopping for coffee at a cafe near the museum where the owner remembered my order by the 3rd week. My son and I talk on the phone most Sundays. It's easier now, with distance. He asks how I'm doing. I tell him honestly. We don't discuss what happened because, as far as he knows, nothing happened. His mother simply came into some money and chose to live her own life. That is, in fact, exactly what occurred. What I know. What I carry with me on those morning walks along the ravine. What I think about when I'm watering the tomatoes on the balcony. What I understood in the quiet of that empty apartment on the day I signed the lease is that Doris didn't just leave me money. She left me a choice. And the only thing that mattered was whether I was paying enough attention to recognize it. I was 63 years old, and I had never lived alone before in my life. Not truly. I'd gone from my parents' home to university to marriage to the spare room in someone else's house, always belonging somewhere, always orienting myself around other people's needs and schedules and opinions of what I should do. The first morning I woke up in the annex apartment and made coffee in my own kitchen and stood on the balcony in the cold December air with no one to consider but myself, I cried. Not out of sadness, not out of relief exactly, out of recognition. This was what Doris had felt all those quiet years. This was what she had been trying to give me. I finally understood. I still think about that Tuesday afternoon sometimes, standing at the top of those stairs, hand pressed against the wall, listening to my son map out my future like I was a problem to be managed. What I've come to understand is that nothing in that kitchen happened by accident. The 3 years I'd spent making myself useful, invisible, grateful, I had trained them, without meaning to see me that way. When you consistently place your own needs last, you quietly teach the people around you that your needs don't matter. That's not blame. It's just cause and effect, and it took me a long time to look at it honestly. Doris understood something I hadn't yet learned. She spent her whole life making deliberate choices about her money, her time, her space, and she never apologized for any of them. People sometimes read that kind of quiet self-possession as coldness. It isn't. It's integrity. It's knowing what belongs to you and refusing to hand it over just because someone else reaches for it. She left me her estate, but more than that, she left me a model for how to live. What saved me in that moment on the stairs wasn't the money. It was paying attention. I could have walked down and announced the inheritance with open arms and let everything that followed happen to me. A part of me wanted to. That part wanted to believe I hadn't heard what I'd heard, that I'd misunderstood, that my son was fundamentally the person I'd raised him to be, choosing to walk back to my room instead, choosing to think before I acted, to call the lawyer before I said a word. That was the hardest thing I did in this whole story. It didn't feel brave. It felt lonely and a little bit like grief. But that's what clear thinking actually feels like sometimes. It doesn't arrive with certainty. It arrives quietly in an empty room and asks you to act on it before you feel ready. And then there's the matter of doing it. Knowing what's right and actually doing it are two entirely separate things. I had to make the appointment. I had to drive to King Street and sit across from Susan Park and say the words out loud. I had to keep showing up to dinners and folding placemats and pretending everything was fine for 3 weeks while I got my affairs in order. That took something I didn't know I still had. A kind of steady, patient endurance that doesn't announce itself. It just keeps moving. I'm 63 years old. I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in the annex with a balcony where cherry tomatoes are coming in slower than I'd like. I talk to my son on Sundays. I go to book club on Wednesday evenings. Some mornings I walk along Philosopher's Walk and stop for coffee and think about Doris and about Paul and about the version of myself who almost handed her whole future to someone else out of love and habit, and the deep human need to be needed. I don't tell that version of myself she was foolish. She was just tired and grateful, and hadn't yet learned that those two things together can make you dangerously easy to overlook. She knows better now.